It was a hot July evening when everything crumbled. The summer heat clung to the air, heavy and stifling, like the secret I'd buried within me. But no amount of scorching sun could match the burn in my chest whenever she looked at me. Her laughter, her warm smile, her carefree innocence, it was a flame, and I was a moth, too close to escape unharmed. When Margot first came into my life, I promised myself I'd protect her, that I'd be the father figure she deserved. But those feelings twisted into something else, something I tried to smother and ignore. Her mother, my wife, was none the wiser. Too busy with work, her yoga classes, her endless projects. One night after dinner, Margot was telling a story, her voice animated, her laughter filling the room. I couldn't stop watching her, transfixed, my heart thundering as I noticed every detail. The sparkle in her eye, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear. When she glanced my way, the world narrowed to that moment. To us, like she was the only thing in existence. I hated myself for it. One night, she came to me. Maybe I had been too obvious. Maybe my careful distance hadn't been enough. Her small hands reached for mine. She whispered my name softly, drawing out something in me I had desperately tried to keep buried. We met in secret, in stolen glances, whispered conversations, and brief touches that set my veins on fire. I told myself it would stop. I swore to myself over and over that this was the last time, that I'd let her go, that I'd be strong enough. But each time, her presence dragged me under, and I went willingly. Then that night came. We'd made plans. Her mother was away on one of her wellness retreats. It was just us in the quiet house. I knew I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stay away. The moment I arrived, I saw the flash of panic in her eyes, the uncertainty. She tried to pull away, to end it, but the rejection only inflamed the fire that had long burned out of control within me. I don't remember the exact sequence of events. There was a struggle, a push, a yell, a cry for help that never came. Then silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. And her, lying on the floor, unmoving, the life drained from her beautiful face. My world collapsed. My body moved on autopilot. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at her. The shock settled in first, a cold numbness filling the hollow spaces where my heart and mind once were. Then came the dread, thick and consuming, like a fog I couldn't wade through. I sank to my knees beside her, my hands trembling as I touched her shoulder, praying she'd stir, that this was some terrible dream. But her skin was already cool, her eyes unseeing. Reality smashed into me with a brutal clarity. I thought about calling the police, but then what? I could picture it already. The flash of cameras, the neighbors whispering behind cupped hands, my wife, her mother, standing in the shadows, with tears and disbelief hardening her face. I couldn't bear it. Instead, I picked her up. Her weight was lighter than I'd expected, her body limp and fragile. I held her close as I carried her down to the basement, not wanting to let her go, even now. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly tripped on the stairs. I found an old trunk, the same one I'd helped her mother haul in years ago, filled with forgotten relics and photo albums from a life I could barely remember. With careful hands, I laid her inside, wrapped in one of her favorite blankets, something bright and soft. I buried her that night, the darkness of the yard swallowing her from sight, as if the earth itself conspired to keep my secret. As the last bit of soil settled over her, my stomach churned, and the bile rose in my throat. This was the girl I'd sworn to protect, now hidden under layers of dirt and deceit. Days passed. I moved like a ghost through the house, haunted by her memory. My wife returned from her retreat, blissfully unaware. She asked about Margot's sudden absence, her growing worry clouding the air in every room. Each question felt like a knife twisting deeper, but I lied. I lied about where Margot had gone, the calls she was supposedly missing, the messages that went unanswered. I became a hollow shell, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Each night I sat alone listening to the silence of the house that seemed to whisper her name. And each night, the guilt gnawed at me, breaking me down piece by piece, leaving nothing behind but a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. But secrets like this don't stay buried for long. It was a few weeks later when the phone rang, late at night. I jolted awake, the dream still fresh, the nightmare where Margot's lifeless eyes stared up at me from the soil. My heart pounded as I grabbed the receiver, expecting some faceless voice to whisper the truth I'd tried to bury. But it was worse. It was my wife. She'd been trying to call Margot all evening, her voice thick with concern and something sharper, something like suspicion. She'd called Margot's friends, but none of them had seen her. "She's gone, isn't she?" Her voice cracked. "Something's happened to her, hasn't it?" I told her the same lies as before, my voice calm even as I felt the edges of my composure fraying. I said Margot had talked about moving out, about leaving to clear her head, maybe staying with a friend a few towns over. I painted a picture of a restless girl finding herself, just as she'd always dreamed of doing. It was a lie that might have soothed her mother's mind, but deep down, she knew. I saw it in her eyes, that glimmer of doubt, and it terrified me. After that, she grew distant, her once vibrant personality dulled into something I barely recognized. She took to pacing the halls at night, checking her phone constantly, watching the door as if Margot might walk in any moment. The hope in her eyes was unbearable. Then, 2 days later, the police showed up. Someone had reported Margot missing. They sat me down in my own living room, their faces carefully neutral, and asked questions I hadn't prepared for. They wanted to know the last time I'd seen her, if we'd argued, if there was anywhere she might have gone without telling anyone. I kept my answers short, letting each lie fall in place as easily as the next. But they came back, and each time their questions dug deeper, chipping away at the thin layer of calm I wore like a mask. They asked me about the trunk in the basement, about the soil I'd turned in the backyard, about the neighbors who'd noticed her absence, each word dragging me closer to the edge. I started seeing her everywhere, in the reflection of the windows, in the shadows of empty rooms, in every dream that left me gasping awake. Margot's ghost was inescapable, her silent gaze a constant reminder of what I'd done. And the worst part was knowing that eventually, the truth would come for me, one way or another. The day the police returned with a search warrant, my heart stopped. They swept through the house like a storm, room after room, and then down into the basement. I felt every second pass like a weight, pressing down, suffocating. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was screaming. My wife stood in the doorway, clutching herself, eyes wide and glazed with dread. She'd sensed something was wrong from the start, but I'd always managed to calm her, spin another lie. But now, as the officers moved downstairs, I could see a change. She looked at me, truly looked, as though seeing the truth for the first time. Her gaze was cold, empty, as if all the warmth she'd once had for me had drained away. The officers in the basement stayed longer than I could bear, their quiet murmurs filtering up to the main floor like a death knell. It was only a matter of time. And then, footsteps. Heavy, purposeful. They emerged from the basement, their faces grim, and for the first time, I saw the trunk in one officer's hands. My heart stopped. They had found her. They had found Margot. They turned to me, eyes unflinching. "We need you to come with us," one of them said, his voice hard as steel. My wife gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, but I couldn't look at her, couldn't face what I'd destroyed. Handcuffs bit into my wrists as they led me out, the flash of cameras blinding. Reporters' voices were a dull roar, their questions a storm I couldn't comprehend. I focused on my steps, one after the other, keeping myself upright when every fiber of me wanted to collapse. The trial was swift. The evidence was irrefutable. Photos of Margot's remains, the trunk, the forensic analysis of the dirt in the yard, all laid bare before the court. I sat silently as the prosecutor painted me as a monster, detailing every deception, every betrayal. Each word felt like a nail, driving deeper into the hollow where my heart once was. I barely registered my lawyer's arguments, half-hearted defenses that couldn't excuse the inexcusable. My wife never looked at me again. She sat in the courtroom, a shadow of the woman I once knew, her expression blank as the verdict was read. Guilty. They led me away, my last glimpse of the world, a blur of faces twisted with horror and disgust. The cell I was taken to was dark and cold, the silence heavy. There, alone with my thoughts, I finally faced the truth I'd buried with Margot. My twisted obsession, my selfishness, it had cost everything, destroyed everyone. Now, in this cell, I have only the memory of her. I see her every night, waiting in the shadows, silent, unblinking, a reminder of the life I stole, the life that could have been. And as the days drag on, I realize that this cell, this emptiness, is exactly where I belong. Months passed in the quiet, sterile monotony of my prison cell. Each day bled into the next, marked only by the stale routines that kept me shackled to a hollow life, a life that no longer felt like it belonged to me. The walls, gray and lifeless, felt like they closed in, shrinking with each passing day, forcing me closer to the memories I'd been trying to escape. But there was no escape, no end to the silence that filled every crevice of this place. It was on a particularly dark, stormy night when my resolve finally crumbled, and I allowed my mind to drift back to those moments with Margot, the memory of her laughter, her warmth. The emotions, once carefully guarded, surged forward, overwhelming, unrelenting, tearing through every wall I'd built around myself. But this time, instead of the twisted thrill, all I felt was an unbearable sorrow, a weight so crushing it took my breath away. I realized, perhaps too late, that love had never been part of it. My obsession, my selfish desires, they had worn the mask of love, but it had only ever been darkness. In those sleepless nights, I thought of my wife. I wondered if she'd ever feel peace again, or if my betrayal had left her forever scarred. The memory of her face in the courtroom haunted me as much as Margot's. The hollowed eyes, the disbelief. I couldn't bear to imagine the suffering I'd inflicted, the years she'd given to a man she never truly knew. I wanted to tell her that I was sorry, that somehow I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But those words were empty now. My regret would never erase the damage. One night, as rain pelted against the narrow window, a letter arrived. It was from her. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, and my heart stopped at the sight of her handwriting, a familiar scrawl that once felt like home. The letter was brief. She wrote that she was moving away, selling the house, starting fresh. "I thought I knew you," she wrote, the words cutting deep, each line filled with a quiet devastation. But there was something else, a glimmer of peace, a hint that perhaps she was finally freeing herself from the ruin I'd left behind. The last line lingered in my mind long after I finished reading. "I will never forgive you, but I will forget you." With the letter clutched in my hand, I felt the full weight of my isolation. It was deserved, every second of it. In the silence that followed, I made a vow to let the memories fade, to confront what I'd done, and to accept that my punishment was endless. For in here, I was haunted not by walls, but by the echoes of the lives I had broken. As the weeks dragged on, I began to feel the edges of my sanity fraying. Isolation does that, you know. The mind becomes a prison within the prison, the past playing on a loop with no escape. Each night, I lay awake, feeling the weight of every choice, every lie, every selfish moment that had led me here. And yet, despite everything, I found myself grasping at memories of Margot. Moments I hadn't truly seen for what they were. Moments I had twisted into something they could never be. One night, I received an unexpected visitor. Detective Rossi, the same officer who'd led the investigation, the one who'd found Margot's body. Her face was steeled, her eyes unreadable, as she took a seat across from me, in the dimly lit visitor's room. She looked me over, as if searching for some sign of remorse, some sign of the man who had once been part of a family. "You know why I'm here?" she asked quietly. I didn't respond. I simply shook my head. She leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "Your wife," she began, but the words trailed off. She seemed to gather herself, then continued. "She's petitioned for a divorce. She wanted me to deliver the papers personally." It shouldn't have surprised me. It shouldn't have hurt. Yet somehow, it did. Perhaps it was the finality of it, the end of any hope for redemption in her eyes. She hadn't come herself. She'd chosen a stranger to deliver the message, a stranger with whom she felt safer than the man she'd once loved. But Detective Rossi wasn't finished. She watched me with a strange intensity, as though she was still trying to make sense of me, of everything I'd done. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I couldn't look her in the eyes. For a long time I said nothing, searching for an answer that might make sense. But there was nothing, no justification, no reason that would satisfy her, or even myself. I was left with a hollowness, an emptiness that words could never fill. I don't know. I finally managed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. I thought it was love, but it wasn't. It was just darkness. She sat back, her face unreadable. For a moment there was silence, the weight of our conversation filling the room. Then she stood, sliding the divorce papers across the table. "Sign them. Let her go." With a shaky hand, I picked up the pen, pressing it to the paper. Each stroke felt like closing a chapter of lies, betrayal, and destruction. When I finished, I slid the papers back to her, my hands clammy, my chest hollow. As she rose to leave, Detective Rossi paused, looking back one last time. "You know, they say the hardest prison is the one we build for ourselves." She gave me a final hard look. "Goodbye, Mr. Henderson." When she was gone, I was left with nothing but silence. No marriage, no family, no Margot. Just me, the walls, and the endless expanse of my own guilt. It was then that I realized my sentence wasn't just years behind bars. It was an eternity of living with what I'd done. And somehow, I knew that was a punishment far worse than any prison. As the days passed in the dim solitude of my cell, a strange calm settled over me, heavy yet oddly liberating. With the divorce finalized, my last ties to the life I'd known were severed. The world outside moved on, and I was left alone with only my mistakes for company. I became a man suspended in time, a ghost wandering through the memories of a life destroyed by my own hands. Months blurred into years, each day wearing down the edges of my regret until it became a dull ache, a familiar weight that no longer tore at me, but simply was. A fact, unchangeable and unyielding. In that silence, a brutal clarity took root. There was no forgiveness for me, not from my wife, not from the world, and certainly not from myself. And I accepted that. One evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the narrow slit of a window in my cell, I caught a glimpse of something outside. A flash of green, a lone tree in the yard, its branches just visible through the bars. I watched as it swayed, gently, free, its leaves fluttering in the wind. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt profound, like a reminder of something I'd forgotten. Life was still out there, moving on without me, indifferent and unstoppable. In that moment, I closed my eyes, allowing the quiet to wash over me. I made my peace, a resolution as quiet as the air itself. I would carry this guilt, this memory of Margot and the life I'd taken. I would carry it until the end, never free, but perhaps in a strange way, finally whole in my acceptance. When the cell door eventually opens for me, whenever that day may come, I know I'll step out a different man, not looking for redemption, but accepting my place in the shadows of my past. For in the end, I had become my own prison, and that was a life sentence I'd carry forever. The sun dipped lower, and as darkness crept in, I welcomed it, the quiet and the weight of my truth filling the cell, settling over me like a final, irreversible verdict.